from a drone in the great quarantine. Barely a rivulet of traffic on Com Ave, and not much on what the kids called Sparrow Drive. Blocks of calm, like the crooning of a theremin. Footpath symmetry revealed from high above. The castle, where BU presidents used to live. The elegant, calm pace of a masked pedestrian on ordinary business, provisional, grave. All Commonwealth, nearly immobile, yet alive. I'll read one other poem, longer than that one, and for some reason it feels appropriate to this occasion for me. The title is Poem of Names. Poem of Names. The chains of begats and births, the chains of names. They are meaning itself, the chains of deaths and doings. The black rain fell on Osama Shimomura. On the walk home, it turned his white shirt black. Quote, my grandmother got me quickly into a bath. It likely saved me from death by radiation. Tuvalu's Ernst Berinsky would not discuss his family killed by Nazis. Quote, an area I have liquidated for my mental health. His grave at Tuvalu, a kind of shrine. Salma beget Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, underground river of passion and retrenchment. Thank you, Elliot, Simon, and Hazel, for wanting to talk with me about my dying someday. Your dog, Catfish, had been so cold when you touched his body. A compliment for me, that conversation. It almost doesn't matter what we said. I thought of Milford, your great grandpa. That time I asked him, did he believe in life after death? I guess that you are my life after death, he said. A boy named Christian at a Q&A in Texas asked me, the visiting poet, what motivates you? What gets you out of bed each day? Good question. Willie Lee Rose, historian of Reconstruction. Micheline Dumont-Oujou, Belgian resistance. The Nazis killed her family too. She ran an underground that saved American pilots. Congressman Pellegrino Rodino, called Pete. It's the dead people, the ones whose names I need to tell you, Christian. That's what motivates me. Emily Dickinson, William Butler Yeats, the shame of Nathan Forrest, of Pillow Hill, the pride of Ernst Berinsky, of Mississippi, Joyce Ladner, his student. Christian, look it up. As to your name, I remember Don Polk saying, a lot of Jewish people think they're white, but no, they're not. In some ways, Yeats was a jerk. Arphaxad begat Salah. Salah begat Eber. Oh yeah, said Ruby to Don. Well, most black people don't know they're Goyim. Somebody said about Rodino and Sarika, the night school guys are saving the country. Berinsky needed a job, but no white school could offer him a position. Tugolo did. At his famous forums there, he asked the students to sit one chair apart, so the white kids from Millsaps sat among them. Pete Seeger, Ralph Bunch, Joan Baez at those forums. Rodino in the House indicting Nixon. Pellegrino means pilgrim. Shimomura discovered cells that made a jellyfish glow. He garnered 1 million samples of them in Puget Sound. A protein in Iquaria victoria, embedded to glimmer in other life, transformed the study of living things. Years later, the Exxon Valdez oil spill left nearly all those Iquaria dead, a poisoning that Shimomura indicted, he whose grandma washed away the ashes. Next. We were asking people to say their names. Leslie, you go next. Leslie, it is your turn.
Robert, I thought it was Nicole.
You're right, it is Nicole.
Isn't it
I'm
Nicole?
Sorry. Nicole's turn. Thank you. Thank God you're here, Karl. Excuse me,
Hey,
Leslie.
everyone.
Nicole Sealey.
Thank you, Robert and Catherine, for putting this reading together, which feels like more work than an actual in-person thing. So thank you guys. And thank you all for coming, because I know you have so much more to do. Just a few poems, the first of which is not by me, is by Lee Young Lee. Want to start with One Heart by him. Look at the birds, even flying is born out of nothing. The first sky is inside you, open at either end of day. The work of wings was always freedom, fastening one heart to every falling thing. And a couple of mine. The first person who will live to be 150 years old has already been born, for my mom. Scientists say the average human life gets 3 months longer every year. By this math, death will be optional, like a tie, or dessert, or suffering. My mother asks whether I'd want to live forever. I'd get bored, I tell her. But she says there's so much to do, meaning she believes there's much she hasn't done. 30 years ago, she was the age I am now, but unlike me, too industrious to think about birds disappeared by rain. If only we had more time or enough money to be kept on ice until such a time science could bring us back. Of late, my mother has begun to think life short-lived. I'm too young to convince her otherwise. The one and only occasion I was in the same room as the Mona Lisa, it was encased in glass behind what I imagine were velvet ropes. There's far less between ourselves and oblivion, skin that often defeats its very purpose. Or maybe its purpose isn't protection at all, but rather to provide a place similar to a doctor's waiting room in which to sit until our names are called. Hold your questions until the end. Mother, measure my wide open arms. We still have this much time to kill. And my next poem is, thank you. I see your hands going. Object Permanence for my husband, John. We wake as if surprised the other is still there, each petting the sheet to be sure. How have we managed our way to this bed, beholden to heat like dawn, indebted to light? Though we're not so self-important as to think everything has led to this, everything has led to this. There's a name for the animal love makes of us, named, I think, like rain for the sound it makes. You are the animal after whom other animals are named. Until there's none left to laugh, days will start with the same startle and end with caterpillars gorged on milkweed. Oh, how we entertain the angels with our brief animation. Oh, how I'll miss you when we're dead. And my final poem is also not by me. Thank you, I see your hands going. And before I read the poem, I just want to thank some of my former students for being here. I saw Laura, Sarah, Tyler, Cody, and Selma. I'm sorry if I missed anyone, but thank you for being here. This poem is by Lucille Clifton. It's called Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. Thank you.
Hello. It's my turn. I'm Sigrid Nunez. Thank you, everybody, for being here. In the past several weeks, a particular famous sentence has come into my head many times. It's the first sentence of Virginia Woolf's novel, The Years. It was an uncertain spring. And that inspired me to write these pages, which may or may not be the beginning of a story. Talk about an uncertain spring. Early each morning, she went for a walk. It was her chief pleasure in a dearth of pleasures, observing day by day the coming of spring, the magnolias putting out their petals, and so poignantly soon as it seemed to her every year, but never more so than this one, shedding their petals. The cherry blossoms, even loveliest, agreed, but likewise short-lived. The daffodils and the narcissi, probably both like crocuses, crocus, and the gaudy tulips that seemed almost like wild mouths screaming for attention. Flowers standing up and shouting red. She couldn't remember who said that or something like that. As she couldn't remember who had compared the spots on the tips of the dogwood petals to cigarette burns, but how nice that they had. Other flowers she recognized but couldn't identify. And there it was again, this thing that had started happening whenever she was confronted with something she didn't know. Could be anything, some historical fact, a date, the right word for this or that whatchamacallit, how the Electoral College worked. Really, everyone ought to know that. But why should she be faulted for not knowing the names of certain flowers? She wasn't a botanist or even a gardener, she countered, as if it were someone other than herself doing the faulting. But it was happening more and more. Times when not knowing something or forgetting something she used to know brought a nick of self-reproach that might have bled if she wasn't immediately distracted, as luckily she was just now, by the mini house some remarkable person had managed to construct from giant pieces of cardboard and a row of open umbrellas, complete with doormat, armchair, bedding, a bureau drawer full of neatly folded clothes, and a framed painting of the holy jogger. She swerved. Don't expect him to do that, wishing she could throw something harder than a look after him. It was strange how badly behaved joggers had turned out to be. The contempt of the hare for the tortoise. They could ruin a walk faster than bad weather, not that bad weather didn't have its advantages. It was the milder days ahead that worried her, the many more people who'd be out and about, scores of joggers and cyclists and even amblers like herself needing to be dodged. And now the construction was about to start up again at thousands of sites around town, so she'd read, including her own neighborhood. Well, goodbye, peaceful streets. Could it be accidental that the names for flowers were always also beautiful words? Rose, lily, violet. Names so appealing that people chose them for their baby daughters. Jasmine, Camellia. She wished her parents had thought to give her a pretty flower name. So many more she could think of: anemone, lilac, azalea. She had once known a bulldog named Petunia. But there must be an exception. There were always exceptions. Could she think of even one? It was the sort of game she sometimes played as she walked. Could she name the original 13 colonies, all 10 commandments, the 7 deadly sins, and the 7 heavenly virtues? It didn't matter if she came up short, and she always did. Something to look up when she got home. The 7 wonders of the world, what was it about 7? Her husband would have known. Her ex-husband would have known all the answers. In the beginning, she had adored this prowess of his, but it had not aged well. The line between walking encyclopedia and know-it-all turned out to be a fine one. And when stacked against more important things, such as getting along with your boss or how to raise a happy child, what did it matter being a whiz at Jeopardy? Then, of course, after he was gone, it was one of the things she'd missed most about him. But who needs a walking encyclopedia, her best friend kept saying, now that we have Google. There was that mnemonic for the planets she had learned in school, but she'd forgotten it. Forgetting the mnemonic. Now that was funny. Like the title for a book, the kind of book she knew just from the title was not for her. She could not think of a really ugly flower name, though she wasn't too keen about phlox. But there were other plants like weeds and herbs with hideous names like vetch. We're thinking of naming the baby Vetch. Meet the twins, mugwort and milk vetch, horehound, wormwood, the name of the devil apprentice in the Screwtape Letters. Did anyone read that wonderful book today? Did she still have her copy after all these years? She should reread it. Though reading could be hard these days, even watching TV sometimes taxed her attention. Never before had she had trouble remembering a show's plot from one week's episode to the next. My very educated mother just served us noodles, perhaps. Of course, just when she wasn't thinking about it anymore, it popped into her head, though no more perhaps, she figured, because no more Pluto. She made a loop. She went from park to park. That's where the flowers were. Early on, before the playgrounds were closed, she had also enjoyed watching the young children, or even just hearing their excited voices as she sat on a bench nearby. And she had enjoyed watching the dogs play, too, before the dog runs were closed. They were all reduced to the state of children now. These were the rules. Break them and you'll be punished, your happy-making privileges taken away. For the good of all, understood, but the dogs, what had they done? Of course, she still saw plenty of dogs being walked, but there was something different about them, she thought. They knew something was up. The somber way they plodded along, brows furrowed, heads low. Now what have they gotten themselves into, those brows seemed to say. And she'd heard about dogs that were so sick of being dragged out so many times a day by their stir-crazy owners that they'd taken to hiding from them. Her daughter, likewise in lockdown, but in a different city, disapproved of her spending so much time out of the house. You're allowed to get a breath of air, she said, but that doesn't mean wandering about for hours. A quick turn around the block, a trip to the grocery store, get in, get out, no dawdling. Stay home. That's the rule. Don't play dumb, her daughter said. You're breaking the rule, and you know it. A vulnerable, her daughter called her. You're a vulnerable, she said, and you need to act like one. Sleepy, grumpy, bashful, dopey. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gail Mazur, and I'm going to read 2 poems, which are more celebrative than I've been feeling most of the week. One is about art, and one is about baseball. The first poem is called Mount Fuji, and it refers to the Japanese artists Hokusai and Hiroshige. Hokusai and Hiroshige, my first presents to you, 2 linen-bound books that closed with looped ribbons and faux ivory clasps. Decades later, we gaped at Fuji from a window of Japan Air and gasped together in Narita, a park so immaculate, White rocks gleamed graphic in a river of gravel. Later still, you'd move between the floating worlds of ukiyo-e woodcuts and Chinese landscapes whose surfaces entered you as if it had been faded. A draftsman's draftsman, Hokusai at 70 thought he'd begun to grasp the structures of birds and beasts, insects and fish, of the way plants grow, hoped that by 90, he'd have penetrated to their essential nature, and more by 100, I will have reached the stage where every dot, every mark I make will be alive. You always loved that resolve, you'd repeat joyfully. Hokusai's utterance of faith in work's possibilities, its reward, that at 130, he'd perhaps have learned to draw. In Edo then, his beloved Fuji was seen as the true source of immortality, as for him it was to be. Will you always give me such spectacular gifts, he asked me that day when we were 20. And this poem called Baseball, I think it's really probably could be called Red Sox. Since my whole life I've lived almost a century of their history. And I just want to explain one or two things. John Updike, a lot of you know, wrote a famous, beautiful essay about Ted Williams' last game in baseball. Ted Williams, who played until he was 40, was always sort of still referred to, at least by Updike, as the Kid. His other nickname was the Splendid Splinter. Updike describes Fenway Park as seen in an Easter egg. And the other reference, which some of you may not know, is to Bennett cops, who were silent movie comics, slapstick comics, who sort of, you know, just drove up street poles and everything when they were light poles when they were doing chases. So this is called Baseball. The game of baseball is not a metaphor, and I know it's not really life. The chalky green diamond, the lovely dusty brown lanes I see from airplanes multiplying around the cities are only neat playing fields. Their structure is not the frame of history carved out of forest. That is not what I see on my ascent. And down in the stadium, the veteran catcher guiding the young pitcher through the innings, the line of concentration between them, that delicate filament is not like the way you are helping me, only it reminds me, when I strain for analogies, the way a rookie strains for perfection, and the veteran in his wisdom seems to promise it. It glows from his upheld glove. And the man in front of me in the grandstand drinking banana daiquiris from a thermos, continuing through a whole dinner to the aromatic cigar, even as our team is shut out, nearly hitless. He is not like the farmer that Auden speaks of in Bruegel's Icarus, or the four inevitable woman-hating drunkards yelling, hugging each other, and moving up and down continually for more beer, and the young wife trying to understand what a full count could be to please her husband, happy in his old dreams, or the little boy in the Yankees cap already nodding off to sleep against his father, program and popcorn memories sliding into the future, and the old woman from Lincoln, Maine, screaming at the Yankee slugger with wounded knees to break his leg. This is not a microcosm, not even a slice of life. And the terrible slumps, when the greatest hitter mysteriously goes hitless for weeks, or the pitcher stuff is all junk who threw like a magician all last month, or the days when our guys look like Senate cops, slipping, bumping each other, then suddenly the play that wasn't humanly possible, the kid we know isn't ready for the big leagues, leaps into the air to catch a ball that should have gone downtown, and coming off the field is hugged and bottom slapped by the sudden sorcerers, the winning team. The question of what makes a man slump when his form, his eye, his power aren't to blame. This isn't like the bad luck that hounds us, and his frustration in the games, not like our deep rage for disappointing ourselves. The ballpark is an artifact, manicured, safe, seen in an Easter egg, and the order of the ball game, the firm structure with the mystery of accidents always contained, not the wild field we wander in, where I'm trying to recite the rules, to repeat the statistics of the game, and the wind keeps carrying my words away. Thank you.
Gail. My name is Karl Kirchwey. I'm going to read 4 poems. I received an email a couple of weeks ago from a poetry editor who was assembling a book of poems about the COVID pandemic. I asked this editor, what is your timeline for this anthology? And she said, oh, we're going to publish it next week. I responded that this reminded me of the fact that there is a wonderful writer named Calvin Trillin who used to have a column in The Nation magazine that was titled Deadline Poet. And he would write doggerel each week, very good doggerel each week as the deadline poet. So, of course, I began by sneering at this invitation, but then I discovered that actually, secretly, I had a couple of poems that seemed to have been emerging. In my date book, I record each week of the pandemic. We are now in week 10, I believe, since at least Boston University shut down. So I would like to read a couple of poems emerging from this period of time. The first of these is called Pavilion. And then there was my last dream before waking in the 6th week of the pandemic, with a late snow falling outside on the forsythia lured into bloom. In it, you and I were making love. It was summer, and moths circled us in their erratic flight. First, one parent, and then another, came to linger and watch, smiling, though they have been dead for years. I tried to shield you from their sight. I said, they know what we have made and what will be left when we are gone. I captured a moth. My hand turned to dust as our parents waited in the yellow light. I stood up to raise a pavilion around us from the banner that grew from a cleft in your body. The second poem is called Sonnet, and it's set in Umbria, in Italy. 1. The old man says with pride that he spent the morning picking cherries from his own trees. They overflow the wicker basket at a lunch held in his honor, where he moves perfectly at ease. 2. His daughter tells me he is much preoccupied with thoughts of death. 3. Later, we are driving a winding road upward to look at a medieval tower bought by some Americans not long ago. There is wild geranium beside the road, and the fields are dotted with crimson poppies. He turns to me and says, 4. There ought to be religion without faith. 5. His mind has a lizard quickness, like the lizard I once saw on a sunny wall, its back emerald and its limbs azure, that fell and then quickly recovered. 6. I feel the drag of language, the gap and delay in my response while a soul waits. I say 7. Faith makes atrocities, yes, but people cannot live without faith. Without faith, religion is just an intellectual abstraction. 8. He looks at me, his face shrewd in the light of yellow bloom, and says, "Are you a believer? The resurrection was never literal, but rather a promise that whatever our anguish, Christ can be present and console us." 10. I do not answer his question. I say, 11. The artists who made the resurrection literal have given us incomparable solace. 12. And then we have arrived, and the moment closes. He directs my attention to a plaque commemorating a partisan killed in the Second World War. 13. The intimacy, the exposure. I do not know where they came from or whether they will occur again between us. 14. There is a grappling in me, the swing and burn of something I know is love. He is once again the public man, alone and smiling. In the next poem is titled Mordant, and a mordant is simply a musical ornament, as when you're playing the keyboard, for example. And the poem refers to a poem by the Italian poet Eugenio Montale, a 1943 prose poem called Visit to Fadin. And it's a sort of an idea of a secular or earthly religion that Montale is exploring. This is the second poem emerging from 10 weeks of the pandemic, Mordant. I wonder whether, after all, as Montale suggests, there might be an earthly divinity for which we are indispensable, within a different order, unfolding its own attributes to recognize and test itself in the limits of an assumption whose meaning we are still unable to know. So that even as, at the end of the 6th week of the pandemic, in a closed room, she practices the mordant in a Bach partita, I do not know whether it is the catch and stammer under her touch of time disassembled that moves me, or the way it is restored to join the child's convulsive sob, always that slight hiccup at the end of exhaled woe in the street outside, under the spindling blizzard of the magnolia, and then the silence after both pass away. But first, the mingling. And the last poem I'll read is called Great Meadows. Great Meadows is a national wildlife refuge that has a couple of branches west of Boston, and the one where this poem is set is on the Concord River. And there are 3 figures in this poem. There is a demented old woman. There is her daughter, her adult daughter, and there is a red-winged blackbird. Great Meadows. The red-winged blackbird sings conch de riz, as the old woman says, "It is my wedding day." Blazon of fire on a wing of coal, as her daughter answers, "Mother, who will you marry then on your wedding day?" And the red-winged blackbird sings conch de riz. "Why, I will marry your father, of course," as the springtime river floods each low place. "And will you come to my wedding day?" as the red-winged blackbird sings conch de riz, and the river flows in a blazon of sun on a wing of dark. "I missed the first one, mother," she says. "I had to, so I surely will be there on your wedding day." Deep in the reeds that are tall and pale, blazon of love on a dark, forgetful wing, as the river moves on to the sea, the red-winged blackbird sings conch de riz.
Thank you for being here. I'm Ha-Jin, and I'm going to read a kind of half episode from the novel I've been working on. I've been working hard on this to meet the deadline. And the novel is called The Song Everlasting. The protagonist, Yao Tian, used to be a national singer, very famous back in China, but he immigrated to the States, and the Chinese government tried hard to bring him back, and he refused. So as a result, the government posed obstacles to his career in the States. At this point of the story, he found a job at a casino in Connecticut called Twin Waters. So I'm going to read from the point, basically the repercussions of his new job. Despite the careful work arrangement, Tian could tell he was a significant component in their daily entertainment program. He performed on the small stage in the bar, except for Tuesdays when he sang in the casino theater with some professional performers, even some pop stars. In the lounge, there was always a crowd gathering to listen to him. Most of them were Asian tourists who were there to gamble only for a lark or just to accompany their gambling spouses and friends. Once an old Chinese woman told him, "I heard you sing red songs back in China, but I had no idea you could sing pop songs and English songs so beautifully and with such genuine feeling." He was touched by her compliment and realized he was a different singer now. His Chinese fans even responded warmly to the English songs he managed to deliver, though he was never sure how adequately he did them. "I won't last a day without you. My favorite things. My own true love." Jesse and other American co-workers were encouraging and showered praises on him if they especially like a song. Tian loved Hank Williams and once sang, "I'm so lonesome I could cry," but the result was a minor fiasco. He couldn't reproduce Williams's deep guttural voice, and his smooth performance of the country song only seemed to confuse his listeners. Jesse smiled and said, "I have to say it's too sweet." Tian was embarrassed and didn't attempt Hank Williams again. Within 2 months after he'd started at Twin Waters, word spread that Yao Tian was working at a casino now. Heated discussions revolved around him. Some people argued that his employment at Twin Waters was a disgrace, while others said it was just a job he needed at the moment so that he could survive in America, where most immigrants must adapt to new circumstances. A weekly newspaper in Guangzhou wrote about his presence at the casino. Attached to the article, Yao Tian's plight, were 2 photos of him singing, his figure superimposed over a stock image of a garish gambling hall. The article described Tian's work as a kind of self-degradation, performing purely to make money and to entertain gamblers. The writer also hinted that he'd brought this disgrace on himself, having abandoned an illustrious career in China and to become a mere lowly entertainer in America. Yao Tian had chosen capitalism over socialism, the article concluded. We can see his tragedy and also learn a lesson from it. Nobody can thrive if he has deserted his homeland. Then the Global Post, an international branch of the People's Daily, published a similar article. singling him out as a warning to all Chinese. Whoever doesn't serve our country or even works against her will come to grief sooner or later. Yao Tian illustrates how a small misstep can lead to a disaster. The Global Post article was picked up by numerous other news sites and stirred some controversy among readers. Someone wrote an article, a rebuttal, on C-Readers Net, addressing the author of the piece in the Global Post. Yao Tian himself might not feel the same you do. Maybe he enjoys living alone and honestly. Maybe he prefers the freedom of a pauper to the ill-gotten luxury of a prince. I can't see anything tragic in his effort to strike out on his own. A reader commented on the same site. Instead of joining the chorus of condemnations, we ought to admire Yao Tian's personal choice and his courage. We ought to wish him the best of luck. But another reader rejoined, it serves Yao Tian right. Anyone who betrays our country will suffer similar humiliation in the end. Some pitied Tian for his loss and failure. Some lamented how hard it was for any Chinese artist to survive once they wandered beyond the sphere of Chinese culture. Some supported Tian's decision to leave China because they saw freedom as essential, like fresh air and clean water. Some declared that nobody was qualified to judge Tian's situation, like how a foot fitted in a shoe, only the wearer alone could tell. A reporter at the Beijing Daily phoned Tian and asked for his response to the article. He only said, "I'm still an artist. No matter where I am, I can still sing my heart out. I feel liberated because I am singing the songs I love. Back in China, I often sang propaganda that I hated. It made me miserable in spite of my cheerful appearance, in spite of my fame as a star. So I don't regret having immigrated. My current hardship a necessary step for my future growth." He took the opportunity to add, "I've been separated from my family for 4 years. My wife is not allowed to come visit me. This is entirely arbitrary, gratuitous. We are suffering for no purpose. I appeal to those in power to show compassion to my family, to allow my wife to come join me." Of course, the newspaper printed none of his words about his separation from his family, though the young reporter did tell him that she liked what he'd said. His friend Ya Bing did his part to defend Tian too. He wrote a long piece on the Literary City website saying that Tian was simply making an honest living and people ought to admire his ability to adapt to new circumstances and to confront adversity. "You all must keep in mind," he went on, "that Yao Tian is a husband and a father. How many of you, given the same setback, could also continue doing everything to support your families? We should applaud his integrity and fortitude." After Ya Bing's piece was posted, most of the negative chatter faded off, though Tian suspected that people still whispered about his disgrace and downfall. Thank you.
So we don't need any better example than Xu Fei's, that one can leave one's country and remain an artist. When this, I thought this was going to be, I thought this was a bad idea when first broached, but having this reading virtually, but after hearing all of you, I realize it's a very good one, and I'm glad Robert and Catherine twisted our arms and made us do it. I'm going to read from a novel. It's not coming out in the fall, Robert, but in February. I see my editor is here, at least. The novel ends in 1943, but there's a coda, little snippets of things that happened afterward. And the novel's about Hollywood and World War II, specifically about how Jack Warner manipulated all the world leaders into doing their invasions in a way that suited Warner Brothers. So we're going to skip from 43 to 1945. In October of that year, there was indeed a big strike at the studios, and Warner Brothers behaved very badly during that strike. So here we go. Variety, October 7th, 1945. WB, victim of vandalism. Famed sign defaced after riots. By Bernard Katz, who was their crack reporter. At some time over the weekend, and in the wake of the Black Friday riots that sent 47 set decorators and other members of the CSU, and that's the Conference of Studio Unions, to the hospital with serious injuries, some person or persons defaced the well-known billboard outside the Burbank studio of Warner Brothers. In what seems a clear reference to the tactics of the studio in dispersing the picketers, tactics that included tear gas, water hoses, armed deputy sheriffs and their baton-wielding squads of strike breakers, the sign, which had read, Warner Brothers, combining good picture making with good citizenship, was replaced overnight with the following motto, Warner Brothers, combining good picture making with good marksmanship. That actually happened. My father and uncle didn't change the sign, but they sent a letter to the newspaper suggesting that's what the motto should be. Studio exec Jack Warner would only say, I know who those two jokers are, and now I know how to make them pay for this. By Monday morning, the sign had been returned to its original condition, and the picketers from the union had returned as well. And now we go from 45 to Washington, D.C., October 1947. A lot of this is actual quotes. Mr. Stripling, Chief Investigator, House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, Mr. Warner, you've indicated that you wish to include the writers Julius J. Epstein and Philip G. Epstein in the list of names you've supplied us. Do you feel that they too have introduced un-American communistic ideas into their motion picture scripts? Mr. Warner, yes, I do. Those fellows did very good work at one time, but they fell off. That's an actual quote from Jack Warner. They always work together. They're never separated. And I would like to add that their work habits are un-American too. I'll just explain that what Jack means there is that Julie and Phil never came to the studio till well after lunch. And the rules were that you had to come in at 9 in the morning. And Jack called them into the office once and said, what's the matter with you guys? So this is not from my novel, but just for your information. What's the matter with you guys? He says, the head of all of the railways come in to work at 9. And Henry Ford comes in at 9. And bank presidents come in at 9. What do you mean coming in here at 1 o'clock in the afternoon? And the boy stood up and walked out and said, then have the bank president finish the script. And another time, they were having a terrible time writing. They didn't know what to do. They just chopped up a lot of lines from the newspaper, pinned them to a piece of paper, handed it into Jack, and Jack again called them in and said, this is the worst piece of crap I've ever seen in my life. How dare you send in something like this? It's absolutely unacceptable. And going on and on, at which point my father, Phil, said, I don't understand, Jack. We wrote it at 9. So back to my novel. Their work habits are un-American too. Mr. McDowell, I'd like to ask the witness a question. The chairman, go ahead, Mr. McDowell. Mr. McDowell, Mr. Warner, during Hitler's regime, they passed a law in Germany outlawing communism, and the communists went to jail. Would you advocate the same thing here? Mr. Warner, maybe it's a good idea. I don't like that taking from the rich part, even if it's giving it to the poor. We made that picture already with Flynn, the mightiest adventurer the world has ever known. Mr. Stripling, may I return to the subject of the Epstein brothers? The chairman, you may, Mr. Stripling. Mr. Stripling, Mr. Warner, you said that the writers Julius J. and Philip G. Epstein introduced un-American language and ideas into their scripts for your studio. Can you give the committee an example of that kind of work? Mr. Warner, well, and this is an actual quote from the hearings, well, the way they write the rich man is always the villain. Seems to me they're un-American because they're always on the side of the underdog. Actual quote. Besides, like I said before, we already, that's not, it's Jack Warner, always on the side of the underdog. Besides, like I said before, we already made that picture. The Adventures of Robin Hood, the greatest bandit the world has ever known. Well, they never met Harry. And now we're skipping to November of 1947 to a piece of letterhead. And the letterhead says, Committee on Un-American Activities, House of Representatives, 80th Congress, regarding the communist infiltration of the motion picture industry. And then J. Parnell Thomas, New Jersey chairman, Carl E. Munt. I'll skip going through all these 12 names of these anti-Semitic crackers. Though all you really have to know is that in the middle, there's one, Richard M. Nixon, California. On the letter that follows those 12 names, maybe I should say this, that these anti-Semitic crackers, when compared to the sniveling sycophants of the Republican Party now, seem to me like a dozen Disraelis. But in any case, here's a letter that they sent to Julius J. Epstein and Philip G. Epstein. Pursuant, and this is a real letter, pursuant to a possible subpoena by this committee, you are required to complete the following questionnaire. It consists of 2 parts. Part A, are you now or have you ever been a member of a subversive organization? Part B, if so, name that organization. Sincerely, Robert E. Stripling, Chief Investigator for the committee. Then we skip down to the answer. Philip G. and Julius J. Epstein, November 1947, Los Angeles. Dear Mr. Stripling, we're happy to complete your questionnaire. In response to Part A, are we now or have we ever been a member of a subversive organization? The answer is yes. In response to Part B, if so, name that organization, the answer is Warner Brothers. actually happened. Sincerely, Julius Epstein and Philip Epstein. And as Porky Pig said in the movies, that's all, folks. Thank you.
Bravo.
I suggest that everybody unmute and we applaud together. Unmute.
That was great. That was great. What a wonderful reading. And the
I have
perfect
the right
ending.
to be very proud. Yeah, and we are welcome to mingle virtually. Thank you, dear colleague.
How else?
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Beautiful reading.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yes,
Yes.
bravo, Catherine. Hooray for Catherine.
My turn.
Thanks and good night.
Good night.
Hi, Andy.
So everybody's afraid to say anything because they're afraid of talking over someone else.
I'm not afraid.
Yes, yeah. Hi, hi.